Good evening. Tonight, I got to think about this, and you know, I shared before in the videos that this kind of caught me a little bit off guard that the actual war started, between the Russians and the Ukrainians, and that even though this has been brewing over there for quite some time. And I have not been following, these events since 2014 in great detail with the Ukraine, the internal, events as they unfolded. I am reading them as they come along, first with the Maidan Revolution, the efforts which were being made by the Russians to more unify or get the Ukraine involved in their political, or not so much political, but more economically, into the union over there they have gone. In those things, as they unfolded. Interestingly enough, is the sovereign bonds the most countries issue. If they're issued, say, like in foreign currency, like US dollars, Swiss franc, or euro, it is predominantly US dollars or euro. If a nation is trying to raise outside capital and they're selling their bonds, basically, or notes to foreign investors, is commonly done in, I would say the great majority is done in US dollars. And after the Maidan Revolution, the first change which came, and I vaguely remember this, there was a mentioning of this on Bloomberg. It was a little tiny article. It's very dark in the memory because it has been now 8 years ago, where Bloomberg pointed this out, or an article on Bloomberg pointed this out, that the Russian Federation would be issuing, notes or bonds in US dollars, but that they reserved the right to make payment in another currency than US dollars. And I didn't think much of it back then. It's a rather uncommon practice because you usually repay the bonds and you pay the interest on those, the coupons, in the currency you sold them in. So if you sell your bonds into, your investment bonds into in US dollars, then you do the interest payments and the repayment of the bond itself in US dollars. That's the common practice, or euros, or whatever currency it might be. But you can see already, this was before, right after the Maidan Revolution, but it was before this whole Donbass thing really started to, take shape with the military activity, warlike activity, later that year then. And of course, that was also prior to the Air Malaysia flight being shut down over the Ukraine by these pro-Russian, supporters, with the aid, obviously, of the Russian military, which brought that plane down. So Putin knew already at that point that if he was to get really heavily involved in the Ukraine, militarily, or politically for that matter probably, but more so militarily, that this would have consequences. And this is how well thought out this whole thing is from the Russians. And so one of the scenarios they must have played through was them, Russia being excluded out of the banking system, out of SWIFT, and other countries not allowing payments to be processed to their investors, like the scenario we're having now, where Russia potentially could default. So in order to have a countermeasure there, they incorporated that in the fine print of the bonds, basically that the Russian Federation or the Central Bank of the Russian Federation could choose a form or currency other than the issued currency. And with that, you could get paid in ruble, basically. So, and that was in anticipation of what we're seeing now. Of course, this is a small thing, an indicator that doesn't really say much, but it shows you on how Putin, his government, the Russian central bank already viewed the possibilities of sanctions, and on how they prepared for this. So nothing right now which is unfolding or has been unfolding over there was unplanned. They may have made wrong plans for certain things, obviously with the military actions, but it was not unplanned. None of this is on the spur of the moment. This was well thought out, not just from Putin, but from several different aspects of the government, from all of their aspects, of their different backgrounds of what they needed to plan for something like this, in the case that the sanctions are going to get hot and heavy, like what we got now. And of course, the shooting down of the Air Malaysia flight, that was probably one of the first indications that this could get, pretty ugly there in 2014. And, we went through, I think, 1 or 2 different governments over there in the Ukraine, with Zelensky now being the latest president. And the interesting part is last year, on July 12th of 2021, the Kremlin, or the Office of the President of the Russian Federation, as it's officially called, published an essay, 5,300 words, written by Vladimir Putin himself. Well, that's at least, he put his signature on that. And the interesting thing is, I read this now 3 times. I didn't read it last year, but I read it now 3 times. He basically wrote a essay in a lot of detail about the history, going back over 1,000 years with the founding of the first Russian state, so to speak, the Rus, the original Rus state, in, from the Kiev center up going north, being the biggest European country, which was very powerful at the time. And it kind of came to a grinding halt with the Mongolian invasion. And then the further developments are described there. He goes then into great detail, through the Tsaristic times, the Lithuanian-Polish, involvement in the Western Ukraine and that sort of stuff. That is all talked about. The Catholic influence forming a anti-Russian narrative in the Ukraine, beginning probably around 1850, somewhere around there. And from the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, then that culminating with the peace treaty, when after the October Revolution happened, or in February already of 2017 with the first revolution, came the treaty with the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and that resulted then in the German Empire, the way he portrays it, is the Ukraine becoming a German protectorate, in return for this, because Germany needed the wheat and raw materials to further engage in World War I, and of course Austria to a certain extent too. And then came the entire thing with the Bolsheviki Revolution, the October Revolution then, and the efforts of reshaping the entire then Soviet Union with the Bolshevik Lenin on top of it, on how they did this, that, and the other thing. And then with Khrushchev basically ceding Crimea to the Ukrainians. And that's basically the Tino. And then he gets to the time past the collapse of the Soviet Union. And now his narrative changes, and it goes into an accusation where he accuses the European Union and the Catholic Church, Poland, and now in that state the Catholics, that they're forming again the anti-Russian sentiment, that they're creating a new narrative there, or have been creating it, an anti-Russian narrative in the Ukraine. And that developed then into this new Nazi development in the Ukrainian territories over there, with the Azov battalion and that sort of thing that came then with it. And so he looked at this, so he describes this all in great detail. So he has thought out this whole thing from point A to point B, basically, of why this cannot be really going on. And that basically everything since the Mongolian invasion has been anti-Russian to begin with. That is, of course, a lot to swallow. He does not mention in his essay, even though he wrote it last year, he did not write in anything about the war efforts or the combat in the Donbass region, except that he states that the United Nations had reported that 13,000 people had lost their lives as a result of the Ukrainian government basically fighting the Russian separatists there. That was basically the bottom line in this. So here again, we're having now the European Union, the Catholic Church, Poland, anything Catholic is basically being blamed for this. And so is the United States for basically helping them, the Ukrainian governments, basically to construct this narrative, of an anti-Russian sentiment. And that ultimately now led to the troop build-up since the beginning of last year. No, since the end of last year. And the maneuver we saw earlier this year, which was basically only a preface to the invasion of the Ukraine. Now, in the end, when you read this essay, the final goal is basically pretty much an incorporation of the Ukraine into the Russian Federation. He doesn't directly say it, but when you read this in between the lines, that's pretty much it. And that would exclude the Ukrainian territories which belong to Poland today. So I do not know if he want to go on and then move into Poland to get this back as well. But I would say the primary focus right now is the Donbass region down to Odessa and Moldova, this whole area. Kiev is the birthplace of Russia, basically the way he sees it, is going to be part of this as well. That's why I said in my other video, when they take Kiev, that's going to be the grand finale. That was the reason why I said this. And of course, because there is a underlying anti-Catholicism in there. This is the reason why Scholz, as a Catholic, has not been very eager going to the Ukraine. Now you're going to have next week 3 Catholics going together. The Italian fellow, Berlusconi, Scholz, and Macron, the French fellow, the French president. So now you're going to have 3 Catholics go over there to Kiev. That is, Scholz didn't want to do it by himself because he probably didn't want to think or have Putin think this is going to be, the Ukraine is going to be a German protectorate again, like it was in 1917 for a very short period of time until the Bolshevik Revolution in October 1917. But it is kind of ironic, and this is what guides Scholz, just for you to understand. He's a Catholic. He's a devout Catholic. And he, of course, is concerned about it, and he feels probably bad about this, I would think, or very careful. But that's probably the better way. That's why there is such a dance on eggshells. So we will see now what this is going to do when these 3 Catholics are going to go over there next week. Interestingly enough, Prussia was never mentioned in there once because there was never really a real conflict between the Duchy of Prussia in any of this thing. What concerned the internal development of the Tsarist Empire or the Russian nation as a self, with all the other subgroups in there. The Duchy of Lithuania, Poland, on the other hand, that was of a bigger concern to him because that was a direct angle of dispute over a lot of things. And of course, as anything in history, it was always a territorial dispute in the first place, which led to these wars and conflicts we had throughout history. But this is basically, that essay is quite interesting. It is published. You can Google it. I do not want to put a link to this because it is directly linking this to the office of the President of the Russian Federation. And I do not want them to be, that link to my YouTube account. You probably understand this. But you can find it. They published it in English. It's probably not one of the greatest pieces of literature written in the English language. But it might be interesting to read. It is somewhat difficult to really predict out of this, but the main concern for him, what he expresses, is basically to preserve the roots of the Russian nation, of the Russian people, with their differences somewhat in their DNA. And that, of course, originated out of the Kiev area. Even though that the Ukrainians itself have a slightly different language and that sort of stuff. But as soon as you say this, you're basically being anti-Russian, because Kiev in the original Rus state was RUS basically. Rus state was started, or it expanded out of the Kiev area. And I'm not an expert on, on the Russian history and that sort of stuff. I have read up on this. Like I said, as Prussia itself never really had a direct conflict until World War I with any of the Tsars empire, or, any region within Russia at any point. Neither did we have any real wars with Lithuania. We had wars with the Duchy of Poland and Lithuania for the same reason as the Russians had, and it was territorial, but that was settled in the Westphalia Truce back then. So that was kind of what I wanted to point out. This kind of explains a little bit with the, anti-Catholic thing is, because Italy is Catholic, Austria is Catholic, there's France is Catholic. These are the predominant, Poland is Catholic. These are all these predominant Catholic countries, which he's really stepping on their toes. And they're of concern now of two things. So they're now the main target. Germany, not as much, but if you have now a German chancellor who is Catholic sending German weapons over there, then they're gonna be looked at, oh, that's the Catholic doing it. If they had a Protestant, if Merkel was in there as a Protestant, it probably would be lesser of an issue. But this whole thing is because it originated out of this whole thing with Austria-Hungary and the Duchy of Lithuania, Poland. Those were Catholic, countries or empires, kingdoms. And so this is kind of the underlying thing in there. There seems to be an old, unsettled part of history that the bad Catholics are going to do something to the Russian Orthodox, that they're going to try to convert the Russian Orthodox people in the Ukraine or the Orthodox people, and they're going to bring them to Catholicism. And that sort of stuff, this is all in there subliminal, and that's not an easy thing to deal with. So here we're seeing now the Vatican literally through the European Union grabbing the Ukraine, bringing all of the sheep home to the Catholic Church and away from the Russian Orthodox Church or from the Orthodox Church in the first place. Whether it's the Greek Orthodox Church, the Russian, it's just the Orthodox Church, the Orthodox faith to begin with. And I think that's something, if you look about it, you can justify anything almost if you look at something long enough, and you could say, well, that's an underlying cause and they're doing this and that and the other thing. And you can basically instigate this long enough and then you're going to have a war at one point or another. However, to actually get to a peace in this is going to be very difficult, because after reading this or studying that essay, I read it 3 or 4 times altogether, because some parts are so complexly written. And then, like I said, I'm not an expert on Russian history. And to read through this, you really can see on how focused he is on the territory. That means for them to have any peace talks, that's not going to happen unless they have the territory. The Russians have the territory occupied or conquered, basically. And then there's probably going to be peace. I think they announced it yesterday that the Russians think this will last until October. And I guess by that point, they're looking at the current movements and advances and everything. By that time, they're going to have the entire Donbas region, including Charkov, back up there. And they may or may not get into Kiev. That is the big question. They may just take a break there. They're going to wait out the winter, and then they're going to have another spring offensive, and then they may go for Kiev and the rest of the country. Highly unpredictable. It's, in this scenario, it's going to be very difficult to see who is going to do what, and to expect the Ukraine to give up the territory is very difficult. The other the other underlying theme in this entire essay is that the Ukraine itself as a nation would be acceptable to him, even though they don't have a real legal standing as a sovereign nation to begin with, based on all of this history, since they're all Russians to begin with. But he wouldn't worry about that much if they were basically staying away from anything Catholic in the first place. And this is probably the reason why he got the support, Putin, or the government got the support of the highest ranking church people from the Russian Orthodox Church. That is pretty much possible because they're seeing the Western influence, and what they mean by Western influence, primarily the Catholic influence, sweeping into the Ukraine. And they're worried about it. That's the same way the Catholic Church would feel, basically, when someone would come in and trying to turn their Catholic people, around and bring them to the Protestant faith or to the Orthodox faith or turn them into Muslims or Jews or whatever. The Catholic Church would have a severe problem, a huge problem with that, if someone was starting to do that. So the churches are very worried about these kind of things, any churches. And so that's kind of the theme in there. So yeah, it would be okay if it was not Europe, it was under the, guidance of Russia itself. So we're bringing the Ukrainians back into the mother homeland, and then everything is going to fall into place. What he also points out is the deindustrialization of the Ukraine since 2014, basically, with being under that Western influence and the Catholic influence, and they said they're losing all of this stuff. And interestingly enough, of course, the Russians have gone the same direction. Look at all the imports. So a lot of these things in that essay are slightly distorted on the way he looks at this stuff. He thinks of the Ukraine as a great industrial center, and there's probably still more industrial activity going on in the Ukraine than in most other parts of Europe. When you look at France or Germany or Spain or even here in the United States, compared to the new industrial centers in China, if you want to use this as a comparison. And so the declining industrialization, of course, is all substituted with imports from somewhere else. This globalization, basically, what he describes. And the Russians going through the same thing. So here yet he can see this and point this out in the Ukraine, but he completely failed to prevent exactly that happening in the Russian Federation. You just have to look at the oil fields and gas fields where they don't have, where the Russian oil companies and gas companies cannot explore the oil and gas fields properly without having the equipment, or the expertise from the Western world. So this is all, I don't want to compare this to Mein Kampf. It is like a very small version of it, but this is kind of how he wrote this out. And there's some similarities there, but of course, nothing to the insanity of what Hitler, wrote in there. It is by far more settled, in everything else, and it is by far not as blatantly anti-Semitic or any of this stuff. But he sure has his playbook written out there in these 5,300 words on how he sees to it. It is basically the world or the gospel according to Vladimir Putin. That's basically the books of Vladimir Putin. The gospel according to Vladimir. We will see on how this is going to play out. The military fronts there, it's going forwards and backwards. I had mentioned that before. It's very difficult to proclaim a winner here and there or a loser, because they may hold a city for 2-3 days, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks, and then the other side starts a more or less bigger counteroffensive trying to get it back. And in essence, what we're seeing is a trench warfare, an Abnutzungskrieg, a war based on grinding the other side down, literally. That's what it means. That's where the term basically came from, grinding someone down. Is you're grinding them like in a coffee mill, you grind coffee beans down. And that's what we're seeing here, sort of heavy losses on both sides. It's taking a toll. It's taking a lot of ammunition and material and manpower and everything. And that is, whoever is going to outlast us, this is what I said in my other videos, is going to be the winner in this. Whoever can sustain this and whoever can supply and resupply, and who has the ability to also resupply the lost and injured men and women. Of course, we have female soldiers today on both sides. It's a great tragedy that it has come to this. But it was somewhat predictable. It was not blatantly open, But with the Russians, you really have to read in between the lines, and you have to be by far more careful of what they're asserting and how they're asserting, and look at the actions, like what they did with their bonds back in 2014, before any of this was really visible on a larger scale, even in the Donbass. Yeah, just food for thought. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do this week here. Oh, the other thing is I just wanted to mention is my little short video. I had also posted the actual video on my Twitter account. And of course, that didn't go anywhere on Twitter. And Twitter actually deleted the post. I guess they're not very appreciative of these kind of videos. So they deleted it. I didn't even get a text message or anything. They just deleted it. That was just so far what I wanted to throw in here. Well, anyway, you have a great night, and I will be checking in.